If you follow media coverage of the Ukraine war, you'll know that clickbait headings are pretty much a dime a dozen. So when I first saw a couple of headlines that basically seemed to suggest that the United States was dangerously depleting its weapons arsenals by supplying Ukraine, my first response was to give it a 45-second time slot the next time I do a Ukraine myth-busting video. But then I dug a little deeper, and I saw just how widely spread this story had become. I mean, seriously, Bloomberg went with the headline, "Ukraine's war is depleting America's arsenal of democracy. Western allies face a choice: send more weapons to Kyiv or save their stockpiles for their own defense." Now, when I first saw that, I wasn't sure whether that meant the United States had finally decided to send 3,000 tanks and its F-35 fleet to Ukraine, or whether someone might be exaggerating the state of affairs a little bit. But the story is sufficiently widespread that I thought it was worth addressing. Also, not just because it was significant in of itself, but because it gives us an opportunity to explore something we haven't done so far on this channel, which is start to touch on the idea of NATO equipment reserves. We've talked about how much Russia has in their back pocket that they can deploy for this conflict. We haven't asked the same question for NATO. So I'm going to cover a few things. I'm going to cover what the original claim is, or what claim I'm trying to address today. I'm going to ask what about that claim is actually true, and should the West panic about the parts of it that are true. Then I'm going to pivot. We're going to look at US arms stockpiles of a few key systems. So we're going to look at what the US Army has in reserve in terms of armoured vehicles of various sorts. And then we're going to discuss a place where this claim is probably more relevant, which is the European situation. Ask, is there a problem, and what happens next? So what's the actual claim that I'm going to try and address today? And I traced it back. A lot of the quotes that are in these various stories come from Senator Blumenthal of the United States Senate, who has put out a number of tweets and made some statements on the Senate floor, all of which suggest essentially a few things. The first, the top-level claim, is that US security is at risk and urgent measures need to be taken because of the number of missiles that the United States has shipped to Ukraine. Specifically, he advocates for invoking the Defense Production Act in order to radically ramp up production of Javelin and of Stinger. There's also a specific claim that underpins this, which is the US has depleted a very significant part of its Stinger and Javelin missile reserves in order to support Ukraine. So let me ask the generous part of the question first. Is any of that statement true? The expenditure figures are true. There are various estimates out there, but the ones I've been able to find suggest that roughly a third of America's Javelin missile stocks have been supplied to Ukraine. So about 7,000 missiles have gone. The United States had about 21,000 in reserve and in service going into this crisis. The figures for the Stinger, in terms of percentage of stock, are relatively closely aligned as well. It might be a little bit less than the share of the Javelins that have gone. The production figures that the Senator states are also generally accurate. Stinger production is definitely not sufficient to replace existing expenditure, and Javelin production, while it can ramp up, and we've talked about this before, it might ramp up as high as 7,000 per year. It's currently running at a reasonably low rate of production, 1 to 2,000 per year, but it's already announced that those production efforts will be rapidly expanding. So the specific claim that the United States has sent a significant share of these two missile systems to Ukraine is absolutely true. So does that mean the hot take is true? No, the hot take that this is endangering US security is frankly a bunch of horse shit. So my next question is, should the West panic about the fact that the United States has sent about a third of its Javelins and Stingers to Ukraine? Well, to answer that question, we've got to look at the two systems themselves, because apparently, according to the hot take, they're so important that they're the only thing standing between the United States and military oblivion. Stinger, to start with, is ancient technology. This is a shoulder-fired anti-aircraft missile, an old-school manpad that originally gained its fame in the 1980s when the United States shipped large numbers of these things to Afghanistan in order to supply the Mujahideen to help them shoot down Soviet helicopters, specifically Mi-24 Hind gunships that were also being used as transports, and various transport helicopters as well. This is a system that really hasn't been in serious production since the early 2000s. Most of the systems that are in reserve are getting way towards the end of their service life, and the only reason there's a Stinger production line at all right now is because there's a small number of foreign clients that the producers are still trying to service. Most of the components are out of production. It is essentially a dinosaur of a system, due for replacement, but not something the Army has prioritized replacing, because there are other systems out there that can counter air threats, or that the United States military relies on in order to deal with air threats. So yes, Stinger was a good system when it came out in the 80s, and it's still performing reasonably well in Ukraine, but running out of Stinger if you're the United States is like saying the bars run out of Bud Light. I'm sure it's an inconvenience to someone, but there's a lot of other things out there that probably do the same job and quite possibly do it better. Javelin is in some ways a more capable system on the modern battlefield, but again, it traces its lineage back to the Cold War. This is ultimately 1980s missile technology that was conceived, and we'll come back to this point, to help stop Soviet tank rushes across the European fields, which you'll note is exactly what Javelin is doing now. All Javelins were not created equal, though. The Javelins that have gone to Ukraine have been largely older blocks of missiles. We've seen this when you look at the shipping containers and the markings on the Javelin missiles that Ukrainians have published photos of. It's usually the old stock that's going first. Javelin's going to be much easier to replace than Stinger. Stinger hasn't been used particularly much by the Army over the last couple of years, and this is largely because, well, the United States Army hasn't really been fighting anyone who has a significant air force. The Taliban and Al-Qaeda and ISIS weren't exactly known for their roaring attack helicopter brigades. So Stinger's really been taking a bit of a back foot, whereas Javelin's proven that it's usable against static targets as well as against armoured vehicles and light vehicles as well. So Javelin's still in serious production and has major export services associated with it. So my point here is Stinger is going to be the more difficult of the two systems to replace. But does the absence of these systems, and we're only at 1/3 depletion, but let's just say these systems were depleted entirely, does the United States have reserves of anything else it could call on that might be able to fulfill the anti-tank or the anti-aircraft role? Because reality check, we've done a lot of talking about the massive armoured vehicle reserves of the Russian Federation, but very little talking about the huge US stockpiles. The US has more tanks in reserve than it has in active service. It has 8,000 APCs in reserve, 3,700 tanks in reserve. That's enough tanks in reserve of various M1 variants to replace every tank that has been lost in Ukraine so far from both sides that has been visually confirmed about 3 and a bit times over. It's a lot of metal that has been sitting there in the United States Reserve. And I'm using 2020 figures here, so they may be slightly different from the 2021 and 22 figures that you may see around the place. My point is, if you look at US equipment stockpiles, they are wide, they're generally well maintained, they're pretty deep, and the US seems to be pretty well prepared for, well, just about anything so far as military contingencies go once you look at what's in their storage depots. Like seriously, that's a lot of metal parked out there. And there's good reasons to believe that it's probably in better condition on average than a lot of the equipment that the Russians have in deep storage that they're going to be pulling out in return. So when you talk about is the closet bare, you need to remember first and foremost that the Army has pretty deep closets. But it goes further than that. The Army that operates the Stinger and the Javelin doesn't have to do everything itself. So when you look at where US is depleting its capabilities, you need to remember that this thing called the United States Navy and the United States Air Force and the United States Marine Corps, that these things exist. So generally speaking, the Army isn't going to go into a combat zone expecting to have to defend itself with nothing but Stinger and Patriot, which are its primary anti-aircraft systems. Stinger mounted on a vehicle called the Avenger is another one of its air defense systems. It's still basically Stinger. The United States, you may have noticed, compared to, say, for example, the Russians, doesn't seem to have that many air defense systems. It's got Stinger, which is an old system which hasn't been prioritized for replacement, which has been allowed to fall out of production. It's got Javelin and a bunch of other shoulder-fired anti-tank systems, but it doesn't seem to have manically prioritized air defense the way that other armies around the world have. And part of the answer here is, when was the last time the United States Army had to fight in a situation where the United States Air Force couldn't deliver them air superiority, or the United States Navy couldn't deliver them air superiority? If the United States Army is facing tank threats, well, it has things other than javelins to kill tanks. I'm not denying that Javelin is a very useful tool for killing tanks, but let's just say tomorrow the United States Army had all of the javelins ripped out of its inventory. It's not like a platoon of T-90s would take Washington, D.C. I mean, frankly, I'm not convinced a couple of battalion tactical groups could take Houston from its police force and its civilian population, let alone the National Guard or the United States Army. And it's worth remembering that there's a really long list of things out there in the US inventory that exists to kill enemy tanks. I guess for the economically minded out there, what I'm basically saying is Javelin is a good with high levels of substitutability. There are a large number of direct substitutes on the market in both the NATO inventories and the United States inventory specifically. Weapon systems that are able to fit the role that Javelin currently plays. Maybe not perfectly, but certainly very closely. There are older guided missile systems, whether mounted on vehicles or otherwise, so the TOW system is still in service. NATO has a variety of ATGMs other than Javelin that are currently in service that could be pushed in, and you've got to look at what the overarching anti-tank capability is. And if you want to talk about indirect substitutes, so these are things that don't directly replace Javelin, but they could do Javelin's job instead, so you don't need as many of them. The AH-64, the attack helicopters are out there. The AH-64 was designed to be a Grim Reaper of Soviet armor. It was designed to kill exactly the sort of vehicles that Javelin's capable of killing. And that inventory isn't being depleted at all, unless there are some prize deliveries to Ukraine that we know very, very little about. I find that very unlikely. The United States Air Force is always keen to demonstrate that it has a ground attack role and capability. The A-10 is always looking for a reason to justify its existence every time the budget comes around. America has a lot more capabilities to call on than just Stinger and Javelin. And the reason I keep harping on this is because the idea that the United States security is at risk because it's depleting a third of its reserves of two very specific infantry-fired, shoulder-mounted missile systems is, I think, patently absurd. I know a lot of my audience is American, so I'm talking to Americans in particular for a moment. Guys, you are really, really, really well armed. Your national security is made up of the fact that you have allies to your north and your south. On your continent, you have oceans to two sides. You have the greatest navy in human history. You have the most formidable nuclear arsenal in the world, a full triad, airdrop missiles. You have a fleet of land-launched ICBMs. You have submarines. You have an army which is modern and formidable. You have the largest air force, the most capable air force in the world. At the end of the day, when people say, oh no, we are depleting our stock of 1980s era shoulder-fired man-pads, our security is at risk, it really misses the overarching picture, which is that America continues to enjoy, and even if all of those systems disappeared tomorrow, would still be entirely capable of doing what its doctrine calls for it to be able to do. And American planning is built on the idea that America should be able to fight two wars at the same time, a world apart, and win them both. And that doesn't change because you're sending Stinger and Javelin to Ukraine. But now I'm going to give the question a little bit of the benefit of the doubt here. While it's a bit unfortunate that America was used as the example, we should talk about the place where this question actually might apply, and that's in the case of Europe. The European states don't have the same deep arms stockpiles, but I'm now going to give the question the benefit of the doubt here. It's obvious to me that the United States' security and capabilities are not at risk through the supply of Stinger and Javelin to Ukraine. But this question could have been posed with regards to Europe, and there it has a little bit more to talk about. The European states don't have the same reserves the United States does. They're not the same in terms of population, military-industrial capability, or historical defense spending, and as a result, they don't have the same ready stockpiles and war stocks the United States does. They've had to dig deeper in order to achieve the same sort of effects. The self-propelled artillery systems that have gone from the Netherlands and from Germany are a good example. The Panzerhaubitze 2000 is a very good self-propelled system, but you might think 7's a pretty low number. Well, that's 7 of the 121 the Bundeswehr has. When you're looking at supplying these artillery systems, they represent quite a significant share of the capability that these nations have available to them. Polish tank donations have been quite dramatic. The Poles had something like a bit more than 300 T-72s in reserve. 232 of them are reported to have gone to Ukraine already. That's more than a quarter of the Polish tank force in total, active and reserve, that's been donated to Ukraine. The United Kingdom has dug really, really deep in terms of getting NLAWs and shoulder-fired missiles to Ukraine. Starstreak is a superior system to Stinger in many ways, and the United Kingdom has been quick to volunteer it. And other countries in Europe have been generous too. The Baltics, and indeed many of the countries of Europe, have been quick to clear out their warehouses of both old reserved equipment, but also looking at active duty and valuable stuff that can go right now. The Caesar system from France, very capable self-propelled artillery system. Not many of them were manufactured, and yet it's in Ukraine now. The European efforts represent noticeable reductions in inventory, and if they keep delivering weapons, which we expect they will, in fact we expect that deliveries from Europe will ramp up over time, they'll represent larger and larger drawdowns in the reserves that the European nations have. So the question is, will that drawdown have an impact on European force readiness and European security? To me, they're two different questions. If you try and answer it as one question, you end up with the answer of yes and no. Yes, in the sense that some of what is going is either inactive service or significant to the capabilities of the nations involved. The fact that these weapon systems are going means that their armies are going to have just a little bit less to draw on in the event that a crisis breaks out. But if you look at whether this impacts European security, I'd say no for three reasons. The first is the NATO allies, and particularly the European NATO allies, continue to enjoy overlapping systems that allow them to do the job of defending their territory. No one's depleting their air force. No one's depleting their rotary aviation assets. These systems still exist. And then they're augmented, of course, by the nuclear deterrence force of France, of the United Kingdom, of the United States. There's three nuclear powers in the NATO alliance. So there's deterrence that helps back up the remaining conventional capabilities of the NATO powers. But the most important reason, I think, the bit that's often missed, even though it seems obvious in retrospect, is the third reason. And that's that the expenditure here isn't one-sided. It's not that the NATO powers are throwing these weapons out, they're throwing them into a giant pit, setting them on fire, and they're achieving nothing. You've got to ask the question why these weapons were built. Because most defense procurement experts aren't out there with the goal of trying to spend as much taxpayer money as possible to build as many weapons as possible with no underlying purpose behind them, or at least you'd hope not. You'd hope that when they skip a school or a stadium or a road or a pension check in order to afford these systems, they're building them for a purpose. So we ask, what are the European armies configured to defend against? And if you look at the armies of Latvia, of Lithuania, of Estonia, of Poland, and to an extent most of the European powers, while you may have some expeditionary capabilities or international aspirations in, say, the United Kingdom or France, a lot of the powers in Europe have built their armies for the sole purpose of dissuading or defeating the Russian army. A lot of the technology and systems that they put into service were built for the specific purpose of stopping Russian tanks and Russian mechanized infantry from rushing across the terrain of Europe. And now they're being donated to Ukraine in order to stop Russian tanks and Russian mechanized infantry from rushing across the terrain of Europe. Ukraine isn't just throwing these things out. At time of writing, more than 600 Russian tanks have been visually confirmed lost in Ukraine. Now, most of those probably not destroyed by the missile systems that have been supplied, but a significant number have. We've got a good amount of visual evidence of these systems being used and used effectively. So, while the European powers may be drawing down their capabilities, they're drawing them down in order to attrit Russian capabilities. And if the European militaries exist for the purpose of countering a threat from Russia, then they don't need as many weapon systems if the Russian army has its back broken in Ukraine. In many ways, it makes more sense right now, morally and strategically, that these weapon systems be advanced to a situation where they can actually be used, rather than rusting in a warehouse for a war that we all hope will never happen. And for me, this is the final dagger in the closet is bare myth. The NATO powers are drawing down their weapon systems. That's true. They've drawn them down in very minor ways so far, but that may ramp up and that may change, especially as the Ukrainians become trained on more of these heavy weapon systems. But at the same time, these weapon systems are achieving really real effects in Ukraine and damaging and destroying Russian capabilities, which is exactly what they were intended to do and which advances European security against potential Russian aggression in places like the Baltic, for example. So where does that leave us? Where does that leave this discussion? And what happens next? Because I think it's likely there's going to be more of this alarmism in the coming weeks and months as individuals in government or in the media sphere look at what's being sent to Ukraine and identify it as a potential security threat. The reason to talk about it for 20 minutes rather than just debunking it in 45 seconds is that ultimately bad information can lead to bad decisions in a whole multitude of ways. The panic over Stinger depletion, for example, might lead to people pushing to put Stinger back into rate production. That means that in 2024, the United States ends up with an out-of-date, shoulder-fired manpad that it doesn't really need. It ignores the possibilities of a new generation successor. It ignores the possibilities of all the other superior manpad systems that are out on the market at the moment that the United States could bring in. No. The single-minded fixation on Stinger may become a political issue, which may in turn make a suboptimal procurement decision. It wouldn't be the first time it has happened. There's also the possibility that this fear, this idea that nations are less secure because of what is being sent to Ukraine, might cause there to be public or political pressure for supplies to be cut off. So this is a really significant idea. While it seems strange on its face, ultimately this idea that the closet is bare has a significant impact on where this crisis goes in the coming months. I think decision makers need to be sure that they ask questions whenever there's an urgent call for more funding or more priority in a particular area, asking, is a system really required? Is this the most important system that we need? What does it do to contribute to our national security? And indeed, is our national security at risk at all? We all need to be calm and understand how deep existing war stocks and capabilities go. And we also need to not be blind to how the threat is changing. There needs to be an awareness that the threats that these weapon systems were created to deal with may be becoming, shall we say, less common or less apparent on the battlefield. But ultimately, I think my shocking hot take is the United States, the most heavily armed nation on Earth with the largest defense budget on Earth that has occupied that position of supremacy for decades at this point, is not in fact running out of weapons after a couple of months of supporting Ukraine. Anyway, brief channel update to close out. First of all, this was a short video that's a temporary replacement. I was originally going to get the Poland video up at this time, but I wasn't happy with the quality of the original recording. The post-COVID fatigue was really obvious through that recording. I sounded very under the weather, so I'm going to redo that one, and I thought I'd put this shorter one up instead, just to fill the gap. Upcoming topics. So these include Finland and Sweden joining NATO once those applications are confirmed and we know a little bit more about Turkey's position. I'm also looking at a Myth-Busting 2.0 video on the Ukraine crisis. I've been collecting myths that I want to debunk one at a time. And also, I just want to say the propaganda and email suggestions, submissions that I've been getting have been absolutely superb. I have a huge supply now. I've been passing that, categorizing it. It's not just about laughing at propaganda. It's about looking at what that propaganda is trying to achieve, because the information war side of this has been very, very significant. And while I think it's going to be funny to look at some of the examples that both official and unofficial media have been putting out, there's a very real serious side to it that I want to look at as well. The second thing that I'll say beyond that is gaming channel. I've created the Perun Gaming AU channel. The link is there. It has its first new video, so for those of you who are interested, that one is slowly going as well. Obviously on a much lower scale than this channel, but you know, it's a hobby and I still enjoy it. I'll also say I have my YouTube plaque, the 100,000 subscriber plaque, which continues to be absolutely bizarre. I will take a photo and share it at some point. I continue to recover. I'm feeling better every day. Frankly, I still get tired easily, but other than that, I'm feeling okay. And I believe I can probably return to long-form videos pretty soon. Speaking of the long-form videos, it seems, I've joked before about what could I finally put out that YouTube and its algorithm wouldn't like, and it turns out that a short-form video on very specific United States legislation was just finally a bridge too far. The Lend-Lease video didn't really bite with the YouTube algorithm. I'm not sure whether that's because of the topic or whether because of the length. So I'm going to be trying the short form a little bit more, and if it doesn't work, then I'm going to move back towards my heritage and my roots, larger topics covering multitude of areas or a specific topic in greater detail. Anyway, that's more than enough from me. Thank you very much for listening. I hope this was useful, and I'll talk to you all again soon.